Welcome, everyone, to The Voice of Meaning. I'm Neil Martin, and this is our special guest, Bill Muench.
Good
I,
morning, Neil.
yeah, nice to have you. Um, I'm in the Okanagan Highlands in the middle of nowhere in the state of Washington, or I would like to say the middle of everywhere. And Bill is in Manchester, Vermont. So you are our first, do you call them Vermontians, or what do you call residents of Vermont?
I think it's Vermonsters. I'm not really sure what it is.
I like that. Um, I've visited Vermont several times. It's a beautiful, beautiful state, particularly during leaf peeping time. I bet the population of the state increases dramatically during that season. So anyway, how I met Bill is the son of Tom Minch, who we interviewed a few weeks ago under My Favorite Teacher. And if you haven't checked out that interview, please do. It's had a lot of good feedback. And we want to go a little deeper into the activities of the Minch family. So we'll continue this investigation, but we're not going to find anything that's going to go to congressional hearings. So you're at the tail end of the baby boomers. You know, I'm kind of in the middle. You're about the same age as my little sister. And tell me what it was like, your earliest memories growing up in the Minch household, in the Syracuse area in the 60s. What are your recollections?
Well, the earliest memory I had, I know that both my parents were teachers, and my dad was pretty much the breadwinner at that time, and there wasn't a lot of money in teaching and coaching, and we lived in a very small ranch in Lyncourt with a really wonderful neighborhood. We knew all the neighbors, and we had a VW Bug that was our main form of transportation. And I remember Dad having to sometimes start it on a hill, push the bug, pop the clutch, start the car, and we would go off. I remember those moments. I remember three boys in the back of that rumble seat type thing that they have in the back of the VW Bug. And at the end of our road in Lyncourt was Henry's Hamburgers. And and we could walk from our house to Henry's Hamburgers to actually buy something that was fast food, but it wasn't McDonald's or Burger King.
Uh, I know, and where did you go to elementary school and high school?
So my elementary school days started at St. Daniel's in Lyncourt. And then when we moved to DeWitt, I went to Moses DeWitt. And then I went to Janesville DeWitt, where my dad taught.
What was it like being the son of teachers growing up?
Well, it was such a wonderful sense of community that everywhere we went, everyone knew my parents, especially my dad. He had either worked with, taught the person, or just knew them because he went to the same stores all the time. And it was just such a wonderful way to grow up when every place you went, you had a conversation with somebody. Now, that would get old when I was in 9th or 10th grade and you were just trying to get out of the store and move on. And if you go to the store with my father, it's a 4-hour deal where he gets to talk to everybody. And if he doesn't know them, he makes a new friend while he's there. So the most amazing thing to me, and I look back at it now and look at it and just try to get my head around what it was like growing up. I thought that's how every family was. I thought that's what it was like. And it was very interesting for me as I started to realize that my experience was really unique because of my father, that it was a real opportunity for me to learn from so many different types of people who had been his students or his colleagues. And then as I went to high school, my dad was my guidance counselor. And most people don't go through that. I would talk to him at school, and he would say, the grades are looking good. We're looking to go to this school. And then I would get home and he'd say, let me see the report card. And I say, we just did this. He'd look at it and go, oh, this is not good enough. You have to do better. And I was like, wait a minute. Didn't we have this conversation at school? The other thing was that you'd have a Yankee game on, and all of a sudden every teacher in school was over at the house watching the Yankee game. So I didn't realize it at the time, but I just fell in love with the idea of being a teacher. I didn't realize it, and I didn't go to school to be a teacher. I said I would never do that. And I went to school at Potsdam, and I did not take an education course. When I turned 30, I became a teacher, which, I see that all of the seeds were set when I was younger, but I just didn't realize it. And it's one of the things that, I learned from my dad, the seeds that you plant as an educator and the relationships that you have with students, sometimes you don't realize what the impact you have 10, 20, 30 years down the road. And I've had students come back to me, and I know students have come back to Dad and said, this really changed my life. I didn't realize it at the time, but looking back, it changed the course of my entire history.
This is very interesting. So between the time you graduated from Potsdam and decided to become a teacher, what were you doing? And please tell us, what was it that prompted you at age 30 to change course?
So at 24 years old or so, I don't know when it was. I was bartending at Stratton Mountain, and I was playing music with my band, and that's what I was doing. And I was just in a holding pattern. I really didn't know what I wanted to do. The local school needed a basketball coach, an assistant coach, and a JV coach. And I loved coaching. I played basketball in college, and I actually coached in college. So I applied for the job, and now I was at the local school. Well, now I had the mornings off, so I was bartending at night. So I became a full-time substitute at the school for 2 years. The school is an independent school, so I didn't have to be certified. So I got hired in 1993 and then began my master's in education at the same time. So I was learning on the fly.
Now, was this in Vermont or still in?
This was in Vermont. This was right in Manchester, Vermont, Burr and Burton Academy. And I started there in 1991. I started full-time in 1993, and I retired last year.
Wow. So that's almost 30 years.
Yes.
That's marvelous. And now I know that you are a movie director, producer, writer, originator of a very, very fascinating documentary that we'll talk more about. What made you decide to do that after you retire, or were you thinking about doing this still while you were teaching?
So I taught ninth grade English for the first 10 years of my career. Then I taught AP Psychology and Senior English. Then I taught an elective called Space and Time, which connected me with a lot of people in the space program. And then my last 10 years, I actually taught cinematography. So I think it's a combination of my love of space and cinematography that directed me toward making this documentary. But the actual moment occurred. The movie is about sculpture artist Pat Musick and her Apollo astronaut husband, Jerry Carr. And my wife and I went to Arkansas to celebrate Pat's 90th birthday in 2016. And when the birthday celebration was over, I said to Barb, somebody should make a documentary about these two people, because we had been friends with them in Manchester. Because of the space and time class, everybody said, you have to meet Jerry. Jerry and I became friends. Pat and I became friends. I don't know if a month went by where we didn't have dinner with them. I felt like I knew their stories very well. And when I said to my wife, somebody should do a documentary, she said, well, why don't you do it? So for the last 6 years of my career at Burton, I was teaching, I was coaching basketball, and on the weekends, I would fly all over the country to do interviews, and then I would edit at night. And I said, except for Jerry in Manchester, Vermont, every other astronaut and every other artist seemed to live far across the country. So I would leave on a Friday night, fly to Montana, do an interview, and be back on a Sunday night and not miss school. And that's how my life was working for quite a few years at the end of my career. So the film then finished, and now that I'm retired, I'm working on the next step, which is getting the film out. So the film didn't start in my retirement. It has just now kept me very busy in my retirement.
I see. We have something in common. We started this YouTube channel in order to spotlight interesting and remarkable people, where you decided to spotlight these two people that both of them have played an important role in American history, particularly during the time that we baby boomers remember well. I find this very, very interesting, and I admire you for doing that, because after previewing the documentary, I recognize these people are worth spotlighting, and anybody who pays attention and focuses on the documentary will learn a lot and get a tremendous insight about what life was like in the 50s, 60s, and 70s in the United States. So my hat's off to you. Let's go back to teaching. 30 years of teaching. What were some of your most rewarding and some of your most challenging memories of that, recollections?
Well, the most rewarding is obviously the connections that you make with colleagues and with students. And I was out last night to dinner, and our server was a former student, and the chef was a former student, and the server went back and told the chef that I was in the room. The chef came out and said hello, and we reconnected. And those relationships mean so much to me. That's the most important thing. I think the challenging part of teaching is understanding that you don't know every bit of the puzzle when you're dealing with another person. And I wish I had learned that sooner. I wish I had realized that everybody that comes to the classroom is hearing it in a different way, is experiencing it in a different way. Some have had terrible experiences in school and are worried about being there, are anxious about being in school. Some have had a bad family situation. Some have poverty and don't, they're not getting the information because they're thinking about their next meal. Somebody had a girlfriend break up with them. Somebody else is totally interested and they love everything that you say. And I wish I had understood that a little sooner, because there are certainly students I would like to go back and realize that their either behavior in class or the fact that they weren't engaged probably had nothing to do with the fact that they were either not intelligent or not hardworking, but there were other things going on at the time. I'm really proud that once I got to that point, there were students that I was able to, there are kids that act out, and if you take it personal, it's usually the thing they're acting out about has nothing to do with the reasons behind that behavior. It's something else that has nothing to do with your classroom. And once you take yourself out of that, you can really sit with the kids and say, look, you're upset. What can I do to help? instead of you're acting like a jerk, stop it. I think that in an overarching educational way, those are the two things that the best part about education is the relationships. The toughest part, I'll tell you what, the other thing is, for all teachers, the toughest thing about education is really, there is no other business in the world where on day one, you walk into a classroom, the expectation is that you are going to be able to do everything that a teacher, a master teacher like my father, who has been there for 35 years, your expectation is to be able to do all of those things on day one. You would never give somebody who is a doctor and say, okay, you got a heart transplant your first day and lock up and turn the lights off when you're done. It would never do that. It would be modeled. You would assist, you would go over. That's not how it is in almost everywhere in the United States. Here's the keys, here's your room, and make sure you do all the things you're supposed to do when you don't even know what those things are at that point. Just that's a sideline, but it's the teachers who are excellent, like my dad, like my mom, who have had positive impact over the years on students, got to that point quickly where they understood what they needed to do, and they could stop worrying about what it was like how you're supposed to be a teacher, and get to the point of impacting students on a personal level and really getting in there. And that's when people can learn and they can move forward.
Space and time. I've never heard of that class. Can you tell me a little more about that?
The greatest class ever made. And I don't say it about me, I mean the topics. When I was allowed to create this class, I already knew what I wanted to do. I wanted to start with Jules Verne and what was the science fiction of going to the moon. And then I wanted The Right Stuff by Tom Wolfe. Who were these test pilots? And then I wanted to go to Carl Sagan and what is the philosophy and the science that gets us way out there. Then I wanted the kids to talk to people who walked on the moon. And I wanted them to read these books, and I wanted them to watch actual footages of launch and just get excited about exploration. And the idea that when we explore, we find out things that can help humanity go forward that we never intended when we went to the moon, that we never intended when we go to the bottom of the ocean, that we never intended. Every one of those situations require you to do science that can impact the rest of us in a really positive way. So that course I fell in love with. And during that time, I met a lot of the astronauts who were in my film. And my students still tell me, I had a student who is about to have a baby, and she wrote to me and said, it is so sad to me to think that the people we spoke to who walked on the moon won't be around when my baby is born. And I talked to those people. And it was really powerful for me to think about, that course, again, planted the seeds to some of these kids to become people that worked in physics, people that worked in astronomy, people that worked for NASA. But more importantly, all those kids are now watching what's happening in the space program, and they have prior knowledge of the people in the 60s and 70s who risked their lives to put us in a position right now to move forward with space exploration and the science that goes with it.
That's amazing. Now that you're retired, is anyone still teaching this class?
No, no. The class was really Bill Muench driven. Unfortunately, it was my connections. It was my idea. It wasn't a mathematical class, but we did show the math that proved some of the information they needed to know. And it wasn't an English class, but they did a ton of reading. It wasn't a history class, but we covered the history. And it actually dealt with philosophy and religion also. Once you start to go into deep space, those questions come up. If someone else were to teach it, which the course then changed to more of an astronomy course when I was done with it. Mm-hmm. So, but I will say this, when it ended, It was the highest ranking class. We had 45 kids, and we had to do it in a lecture hall. And you could never do that today, because it was an hour and a half class. And I was lecturing, or we had people talking, and the kids were responding. It wasn't just all lecture, but it's certainly, with everybody's cell phone now, you couldn't keep their attention that long. So I'm glad I ended it when I did.
That's amazing. But this rhymes with something that you might know about a little bit. When I was in JD, I took a class called Advanced Math and Science, taught by a man by the name of Dr. Alcott Gardner. And I know he was a friend of your dad's. And he was, I think, a professor, and he decided to teach high school for a couple years before he finally retired for good. And he developed this class. We studied everything from statistics to counting the stars in the universe, and learning that at the time the known universe was 2 billion light years circumference. And we were just all enthralled by this class. And I'm quite sure that also after he retired, that they probably didn't teach that class anymore. And I'm wondering if he was one of those buddies that came over for a Yankee game or something. Um, it's amazing, and perhaps we can plant a seed, because someday, this film is going to be wildly successful and will have a life of its own, and you're still going to be a young man. I would strongly recommend that you pursue developing this space and time class, online, or something that people can do. It gives me goosebumps. So, thank you for sharing that. Let's get back to the artist and the astronaut. Tell me more about what it was like to produce this film, and obviously your connection with the space program now makes sense. I was thinking, how can somebody from the outside be able to, get all these interviews and this footage? So that answered that question. Let's talk more about the film and what you would like to see happen to it and with it.
Well, there's two things. One, you want to get as many eyes on the film as you can. I was really glad that at the Woods Hole Film Festival, we had 50 older people who were over 50, bought tickets, did not know anything about it, and loved the film. And it's obviously in their wheelhouse, because the 60s and 70s, a lot of them had gone through it. The following week, we were in Greenpoint, Brooklyn, and everyone was under 50. And we had the same response. So it's obvious that this film plays toward people of a certain age, but I didn't want it to be strictly for someone who lived through the events to enjoy the film. So the key to me is getting as many eyes on the film, traveling with the film right now, because we believe that the conversation after you watch the film is as important. And especially coming out of COVID, the idea of going to a theater, a lot of people hadn't been in a theater in a few years. Most people don't go to a theater to watch a documentary. So going into a theater and watching, and I have to say, it's a really strong film. And I'm not saying it's because of what I did. It's like when you have a child and you say, it's a little baby, and my baby, that's nice. You can take credit for that. As the child grows up and becomes in their 20s and 30s, you can stand back and admire your children and what they're doing and not take credit for it. And that's how I feel about the film. I stand in the back of the theater now and watch the audience laugh together, gasp together, and cry at different parts. And I stand back there and realize that these stories need to be heard by all ages, and that it is, there are too many people in the film that have passed away since I've done the interviews. Making the film, And sitting in the room with these people was such an honor at every moment, at every turn, whether I was sitting with Ed Whitfield, who spoke about Willard Straight Hall, the takeover in 1969, and sitting in a room with him and hearing what it was like to be a young Black man who was a genius engineer, and yet they're burning crosses outside his dorm. And you know, I was showing that to the students to say, look, there is different Americas. People have different upbringings. When I went to college, I didn't worry about anybody threatening me. And here is this kid who is a genius, and he's being threatened because of the color of his skin. And the film gives the kids a chance to understand that. And people of our age have a better sense of it, you know, and sitting with him, you know, impacted me profoundly. And then to fly to Montana and sit with Frank Borman, the first commander to orbit the moon, and have him tell me what it was like to put his thumbnail up and cover the earth. I just sat there saying, how many people get to have these conversations, and then to take that film and say, no, I can give this to everyone else now. People can watch the conversations I had with these amazing people.
I previewed the film now twice, and even on the second time watching it, I got to laugh and cry, and it's an incredible film. And if I was a high school or even college American history teacher, I would air that film, you know, maybe in 2 separate classes, part 1 and 2, or the whole thing together. It's amazing, and I hope that someday all of our followers and all of my friends and acquaintances will have a chance to watch this film. Did you ever have concern? The film is about 2 hours long, or almost 2 hours long, about that not holding people's attention span. You know, we're in a crisis now. People are so distracted by things. Did you have those concerns? And when you observed audiences, did you see many people falling asleep or playing with their iPhones, you know, in their laps or stuff like that?
Well, that's a great question. So the film is start to finish 99 minutes. So it's,
yeah,
without the credits, it's your hour-and-a-half documentary, which is kind of a sweet spot. Again, the film captures amazing stories. So I'm not talking about myself, and I won't take credit for that. But I am telling you, nobody gets up during the film. Nobody. And in all of our screenings, nobody leaves. They have questions. And my father did a screening in Florida. And it was with a lot of people that didn't even know what they were coming to watch. All right, they didn't know it was a documentary. They didn't know if it was a narrative film. And we had about 50 people show up, and a lot of them came in like, why are we here? Blah, blah, blah. And then we had the film. Now, the people that were there all lived right near where we were showing the film, and they could get up and leave and walk home if they didn't want to be a part of it. Not only did nobody leave, everyone stayed. They had questions. Every single screening, somebody comes up to me and they're in tears and says, I remember that moment, and I want to tell you where I was. So as far as length goes, without question, I'm pleased with the length. It took me forever. I actually edited the film by attrition. There was a 5-hour version of the film. Then there was a 4-hour, 3-hour, 2-hour, and I arbitrarily knew I wanted it to be about 90 minutes. And I had to keep making some cuts that were very difficult for me, things that I felt were critical to be in the film, but really didn't move the story forward. And I had to get rid of some of those pieces, which was really difficult.
Well, maybe someday you can offer some of us aficionados the 5 hour version, um, because it's an amazing portrayal of history, but doing it with personal stories intertwined. Bravo to that. There, if you were a great historical fiction writer, you could write a story about these two, but it was all true. It's an amazing film, and I look forward to you spreading it around, and we hope to someday get you out to remote Eastern Washington to do a screening and talk, because it's great. Anything else you'd like to add about the film, about significant events in your life, about what it was like with wonderful parents who've now been married for 63 years?
Well, I think that with the film, I do. There's a couple things I do want to say of memories of my parents. I want to get to. I'll make them quick. But with the film, if people just go to the website, if they are interested in hosting a screening, all they have to do is contact us, and I would, gladly get them a screener's copy so they know what the film is. The film sells itself. I don't need to hard sell it. And we just want to be traveling the country with the film right now. I remember, it's funny, Vietnam is an issue in the film. It's an underlying issue, and certainly the space race and the moon landing are underlying issues in the film. And I have very strong memories of landing on the moon. I was only 7.5, and I listened to every bit of it. My dad had the reel-to-reel tape recorder and was taping the audio off the television of the landing. The landing occurred in mid-afternoon, and then there was supposed to be a sleep period. And I was 7.5, whatever. I fell asleep at 9 o'clock. I believe it was 10:30, 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time that Neil Armstrong decided, he overruled Mission Control, said they can't sleep, and they were going to go out and do the moonwalk. And my dad woke me up. He didn't ever want us to miss historical events. And I remember waking up and going downstairs, and we watched the moonwalk. And obviously that affected me. I was hooked from that moment on. I mean, this is unbelievable. And then during the Vietnam era, where people were being drafted, then they said, well, if you go to college, you have to get drafted. Then they took that away and said you had to be, married. And then people were getting married. So all of those things that were in the way of people getting out of the draft, who didn't believe in going to Vietnam, but didn't have the money, didn't have the money to go to college, who didn't want to leave the country. They were embarrassed because the parents were saying, this is your war. Mine was Korea, or mine was World War II, and this is your war. And a lot of these students, didn't have the money to pull that off. I remember so many times where my dad paced when he talks, he paces back and forth. And we had we had to get a long phone cord. If you remember the long squirrely phone cords, that it gave him 10 feet to walk. Of course, it would get less and less as it tangled up, and he would get closer and closer as he paced. And he smoked cigarettes back then. So I remember in the dark, I couldn't hear the other conversation, but these kids would call at night, probably on a phone that their parents couldn't hear, and were telling Dad they were embarrassed to leave the country, but they didn't want to go to Vietnam, didn't know where Vietnam was. I don't even know why I should go there and fight for this war I don't understand. And I remember my father giving them hours to counsel them, help them make the decision for themselves. Everyone had, different issues, different reasons for not wanting to go to Vietnam or wanting to go to Vietnam. I mean, it was dividing the country, and Dad was kind of in the middle there, trying to give people some useful information to help them make a decision that would change their life. I mean, one of the scenes that didn't make it in the film because it didn't really affect Pat or Jerry was explaining the draft system and talking to a few people who were drafted and what it was like to listen to the radio and hear your number come up and realize, that at 18 years old, your life has now changed and it was out of your control. It was not your choice. It's something that young people today couldn't imagine, that somebody would come in at 18 years old and say, no, this, you want to go to college or you want to travel? No, this is what you're going to do. So those are two things that I wanted to mention that are really strong memories of being Tom Muench's son. And I just remember sitting in the living room and watching him in the kitchen, going back and forth, talking to, and you could tell it was a very serious conversation. And I was 8 and 9 years old. I didn't have to know much, but I could sense how important the conversations were.
Oh, I bet. And when we do subsequent interview with your dad, we did not talk about that era that much. I was in college when they instituted the lottery, and I still have a little bit of survivor guilt because my number was high enough that I wasn't drafted. But just by lottery, people's lives changed or didn't. It looking back at those days it's just very scary. But thank you for touching on that as you did in the movie, and many other issues and things that were of concern in the 60s and 70s. When your dad was my teacher, was the year that Kennedy was shot. And could you imagine, the school was closed immediately. And his class was in the afternoon we didn't attend class that day, but going back to class the next week and after Oswald was shot, can you imagine the conversations that were going on in his class? There were tumultuous times. Or a little before that, the Cuban Missile Crisis, which you did touch upon in the film, and air raid drills in Syracuse. You had to put your head against the wall when the sirens were going, as if that would help if an atomic bomb was dropped, and the fallout shelter craze and all of that. Those memories are still very vivid, and thank you so much for spotlighting this, not only for all of us who lived through that, but for people who want to learn about that era. And I look forward to helping you get the word out, and I will probably watch that a couple more times during my lifetime. So thank you so much. So I'll put in the notes your web address, and people can contact you through that. I know your email is at the artist and the astronaut, and you're very easy to get in touch with. Bill is also on Facebook. You can send him a message and say, I saw your interview. Can we become friends? Like Bill's dad, I can see he's very social and comfortable with people. I'm very, very appreciative of your time. And I think I'd like to go further. You mentioned that perhaps we can get Pat on interviewed and maybe preview some of her art and learn about her perspective Um, but I don't want to be more a spoiler of this documentary. I think it'll be very soon that it will be widely available, so you'll all get a chance to watch it. Any parting thoughts before we close, Bill?
Thank you so much for asking such great questions. There are things that I hadn't thought about or considered for a very long time.
Good. Well, we hope to hear more from you because you, even though you might be considered an amateur, that film was so well done, and particularly your buddy who composed the music. It's, it was great. Music is very important when it accompanies movies, and so all the best to you. We will hopefully hear from you again, and thank you again.
Great. Thank you, Neil.